Thank you so much, Rodi. And without further ado, on behalf of tonight's organizing committee and UP Agape Christian Fellowship, it is an honor to introduce our distinguished speaker. Dr. Joseph W. Bergeron is a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation. His decades of experience in determining injury, causation, and impairment gives Dr. Bergeron unique insight to Jesus' cause of death. He also provides analysis of the hallucination hypothesis that propose naturalistic explanations for Jesus' resurrection. Dr. Bergeron is also a published author. He has written a peer-reviewed medical journal article on Jesus' cause of death and a peer-reviewed theological article on the hallucination hypothesis in collaboration with Gary Habermas, PhD, of the Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary. In addition, he provides an expanded look at his investigations in his book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, a medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ. Dr. Bergeron also lectures in conferences, churches, and universities on the medical perspectives of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Joining us today live from the United States, let us give a warm round of virtual applause to Dr. Joseph Bergeron.
Good evening, everybody. Do you hear me okay, Marielle?
Yes, we hear
Can
you
everybody hear
okay.
me? Okay, very good. And you see my image. So thank you for inviting me. It's a wonderful organization, and I'd like to thank Agape Christian Fellowship for inviting me today. It's an honor to be with you. We're going to talk about a medical examination of the death and resurrection of Christ. I published a peer-reviewed medical journal article in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine on Jesus' cause of death in 2011. And I would encourage you all to obtain that if you can through your university library. It's really a dissertation on shock. It's not a Sunday school lesson, and it will be useful to you in your study, I think. After that, in 2015, I published with Gary Habermas, who's a guru in the resurrection of Christ, written many books and articles, and analyzing the psychiatric hypotheses for the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection, largely related to hallucinations. This is the most comprehensive treatment of this topic, either in medical, it's not really medical literature, but in theological literature. And if that's a point of interest to you, then I would encourage you to get that article also. And if you have trouble getting them, reach out to me through my website, crucifixtiondoctor.com, and I'll see that you get a copy. Both of those form the basis of my book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, a Medical Doctor Examines the Death and Resurrection of Christ. And I'm going to give you an overview of that content. There's a lot of information, historical content, and otherwise. It's the product of 10 years of study and research. And I'm not trying to sell you the book. If I make any royalties, I donate them. But it may be something that will have interest for you. So I would encourage you to obtain that if you like. And I'd be happy to provide one to your medical school libraries if you can contact me again through my website. I'd be happy to do that. What we're going to talk about is the events from Jesus' arrest to and through the crucifixion, sweating blood, Roman crucifixion practices, the major proposed causes of death. There have been many, but the main ones that you hear in popular discussion. We'll focus on traumatic hemorrhagic shock, and what I proposed was that the factors were present for trauma-induced coagulopathy, which is a complication of shock where the blood loses its clotting capability. Finally, we're going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus and analysis of hallucination hypotheses. The passion of Jesus Christ, passion in the old meaning of the word means suffering. After the Passover Seder, Jesus' Last Supper, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, probably about 9 o'clock or so, arrested maybe about midnight. Then he was taken to the home of Annas who was the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, and then transferred to Caiaphas. That's where they had a secret trial and that he was beaten. Then he was transferred to Pontius Pilate early in the morning. Pontius Pilate tried to deflect the situation and send him to Herod Antipas, who was the king of Galilee. Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, who killed the children when Jesus was born. But Herod the Great died in about AD 4. Herod Antipas was his son. The kingdom was divided among Herod's son at Herod the Great's death. Then Jesus was returned to Pontius Pilate, where he was caned and beaten by a company of soldiers, so he was very, very beaten. Then he was scourged prior to the execution. Then he was delivered to be crucified. He was on the cross 9 a.m. per Mark's Gospel, noon per John. All the synoptic Gospels state that the time of death was 3 p.m. And you may know there are minor discrepancies in detail in the Gospels. That's beyond the scope of our discussion today. I would point you to the writings of J. Warner Wallace, and particularly his book, Cold Case Christianity, and I reference that well in my book also, but that's not a point of concern. Rather, it points to authenticity within the gospel accounts. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, where he was in an extreme state of anxiety. There, being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down to the ground. In medical terms, that's called hematidrosis, and some scholars have even questioned whether that verse was in the original manuscripts, because it's such a peculiar description, but it really happens, and it's only in Luke's gospel. Luke was a physician, and I think he probably thought it was a relevant fact. It has been written about in medical literature. Hollebuck's review in the Journal of Internal Medicine describes 76 cases. What we're really focused on here is psychogenic hematidrosis, and specifically single episode psychogenic hematidrosis. And that there are very few cases of that. It's always reported just with the threat of physical injury, and most often with impending execution. The descriptions vary from edema, hypersensitivity of the skin, expressible blood. There have only been a couple of cases that have been reported and well studied. One in 2008 of a 14-year-old Thai girl who was admitted and evaluated extensively. All of her blood indices and coagulation indices were normal. And her hematidrosis episodes resolved with lorazepam. Presumably these were mediated by anxiety. And here you see in the palm of her hand the sweaty blood. Here's a biopsy where you see blood cells collecting in vacuoles in the dermis. And it was still a mystery about why this was happening. You can see there's no vascularization of the vacuoles. So they didn't exactly know how these were forming. And that the vacuoles then extruded directly through the skin or through the hair follicle. The sweat gland apparatus was not involved. Here's a more recent case from the Journal of Canadian Medicine. Are my slides keeping up? It looks like there's a lag. Mariel? There we go. This is a case from the Canadian Medical Association Journal of a young woman who had hematidrosis. And again, this young woman was treated for anxiety where her symptoms diminished. In this particular case, the biopsy was normal. So they really didn't have a sense about why this was happening. And again, all of her coagulation indices were normal. And I should point out that self-inflicted wounds or anything like that would be easily recognized on biopsy slides in either case. There was no evidence of that. So in a larger sense, we still really don't understand how this occurs, and it may vary in the mechanism from individual to individual. Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, and then you can see the pathway. He was taken to the palace of the high priest, Annas and Caiaphas. This is thought to have been a multi-generational mansion. Then he was transferred to Pilate. Pilate again wants to deflect the situation, so he sends Jesus to Herod Antipas. Then Herod sends him back to Pilate, where he is beaten, then scourged, then taken or to march to the execution site, of which there are two potential sites for Golgotha or archaeologists think that way. So Jesus would have walked approximately 3.5 kilometers or 2.2 miles from the time of his arrest to the crucifixion. He was on trial in the home of Annas and Caiaphas, again a multi-generational mansion, and this is a important point in the context of Jesus' beatings and what would have made his beatings beyond that of the others crucified with him, because he was convicted of blasphemy. Now, blasphemy in Hebrew law was punishable by death, and the Jews had lost capital authority by the time of Jesus' life, but they had authority to provide corporal punishment however they wished. So you can understand that Jesus would have been severely beaten, most likely in this situation after that trial. Then he's sent to Pontius Pilate. Pilate again seeks to diffuse the situation. He doesn't find anything wrong with Jesus, as you know. So he sends Jesus to Herod Antipas. Again, Herod Antipas, there are too many Herods in the Bible. There's Herod the Great, there's Herod Antipas, his son, who met Jesus the day of his crucifixion. He also executed John the Baptist. And then the last Herod was Herod Agrippa in Acts chapter 26 that Paul spoke to. And so it's a little bit confusing, but Herod Agrippa was the last in the Herodian dynasty. But Jesus met Herod Antipas the morning of the crucifixion. He's then sent back to Pilate, and Pilate continues to try to deflect the situation, and he says to the crowd, "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked, and they all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" Pilate asked. But they shouted the louder, "Crucify him." And when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." And all the people answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." Now, this is not a Roman custom. What Pilate was doing was invoking Jewish law, something everyone would have understood. If someone was murdered and thrown on your property, you had to absolve that situation by doing a sacrifice. And that's in Deuteronomy chapter 1, where the law stated that they were to take a heifer that had never been worked and worn a yoke, take it into the valley where there was a flowing stream of water, and they were to break the neck of the heifer, and then the elders of the town nearest the body would wash their hands over the heifer, and they would declare, "Our hands did not shed his blood." And so Pilate was indicting the crowd for murder in a way that they would all understand and recognize, and absolving himself from any involvement in the murder of Jesus. I want to talk for a minute about the crown of thorns. This is a depiction of Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar had received the corona civica, or the civic crown, for saving someone's life in battle. And crowns in the Roman Empire initially were made of plant material. They passed through time to become precious metals and gems that we understand today as in more modern diadems. But in early Roman times, they were plant material, and the highest honor anyone could receive in the Roman Empire was called the crown of grass, or the corona gramina, or the corona obsidionalis, the crown of the siege. And how someone would receive that was it would be a general within the army, and by unanimous vote of the army, it would be awarded if the general, through his brilliance and bravery, saved the army from destruction and led them to victory. And so it was the highest honor anyone could obtain, and it was fashioned from plant material from the area that they had conquered. And so it's my opinion, and not mine alone, but many think that when the soldiers were mocking Jesus with a crown of thorns, they were bringing up this imagery of the crown of grass. So they were mocking him as much as they could, and you can understand the hatred they would perceive of Jesus as being a political insurgent. The crucifixion victim would then be lashed. They would be whipped with a whip called a flagrum, which would have leather strips with lead pieces sewn into the ends. They would be whipped all over the body. The crucifixion team, there'd be more than one people involved in the whipping. The 4th century historian and Christian church father Eusebius wrote that for the scourging, that bystanders were struck with amazement when they saw them lacerated with scourges even to the innermost veins and arteries, so that the hidden inward parts of the body, both their bowels and their members, were exposed to view. Here's a prophetic verse from Isaiah. Isaiah lived 700 years before Christ. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Another verse from Isaiah, he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. I'm going to talk to you about Roman crucifixion practices. The Romans had an intense and vigorous belief in capital punishment as a deterrent. This is a still from Stanley Kubrick's 1960 movie Spartacus. The Spartacus rebellion was very successful. It was in 70 BC, and the Romans had to dispatch 30,000 troops to quell the uprising. As a result, the Romans crucified 6,000 people on the Appian Way, which was a Roman highway from 120 kilometers stretching from Rome to the southern part of Italy. So can you imagine 6,000 people being crucified, and the deterrent that would have been to the local population? So they used crucifixion liberally, particularly for runaway slaves, political insurgents, and egregious criminals. It was not used for Roman citizens except in very rare case. The crucifixion is thought to have originated in the 6th century BC. It was adopted by the Roman Empire in 300 BC and ceased somewhere about 341 AD during the reign of Constantine. The exact time is not known, since that history has not survived to this time, but it is known that crucifixion did not extend beyond the reign of Constantine. There would be an execution team, a quaterno of 4 soldiers directed by an exactor mortis, who was a centurion, who provided certification of death to the local authority. And we see that in Mark chapter 15:45, where Pilate obtains verification of Jesus' death from the centurion before releasing the remains. The crucarius was, that's the condemned person to be crucified, was scourged. They would carry the patibulum, which was a horizontal section of the cross to the execution site, maybe about 30 kilograms. Crucifixion occurred in a conspicuous location just outside the city. Again, it was meant to be a deterrent for everyone to see. There are various types of crosses discussed in history. The crux simplex would be a simple stake, and they did impale people and suspend them on a stake, burn their bodies, and that sort of thing you know about. The most common cross we think of is the crux emissa, but what was more common was the crux commissa, and that's the type of cross that was used in Jerusalem in the first century. And you see that there would be a vertical section of the cross called the stipes that was permanently fixed in the ground. The horizontal section would be carried by the victim to the site, their arms nailed. Then the soldiers would lift the patibulum with the attached victim and place it on top of the stipes in a mortise and tenon coupling. There's traditionally thought to be the St. Andrew's cross in the form of an X, but I would tell you that there is disagreement historically about whether this was used in that time period. So it was the crux commissa that Jesus died on. Here you see the victim would carry the patibulum. They would walk naked through the street to the execution site. Jesus' clothes were taken from him at the crucifixion site. They would carry the titulus, or the titulus crucis, which would state the crimes for which they were being executed in the local language of Hebrew, the administrative language of Latin, and then in the common language, Koine Greek, which was the lingua franca, or the common language of the Mediterranean world at that time. The cross, the horizontal section again would be lifted on top of and placed on top of the stipes by a mortise and tenon coupling. It had to be short enough so that the Romans could reach that. So that the height of the cross would be 1.5 to 1.8 meters. And so you can understand that when someone was on the cross, they were basically eye to eye with their executioners. There are literary references to a sedile, which was a seat that's depicted by the artist here, except I would say that you can understand the carpentry demands to put those on all the crosses made it unlikely that this was a common thing, and it would not have been for individual comfort. It would have been more to make them uncomfortable, probably something more like a stake. To talk about the nail through the hand, you can see the size of the nail and what it would look like. Now, if you put a nail in the center of the palm, that would pull out with about 100 pounds of distraction force. But if you bend your ring finger down as far as you can until it touches the bottom of the vertical wrist crease in your palm, if you drive a nail through that spot, it will go through the carpal bones without fracturing them and provide a stable fixation to 240 pounds of distraction force. How do I know that? Well, Dr. Barbet did experiments. Dr. Barbet was a French surgeon. He wrote The Doctor at Calvary, which is a classic book published around 1950. And he took, I believe it was a dozen arms that he had amputated, and he drove the nail through the wrist of those freshly amputated hands, and each of them went through the carpal bones, as is illustrated by this x-ray. It formed a stable fixation and didn't fracture any of the bones, and it was uniform in all of his subjects. So this is most likely the way the nail was affixed through the palm. The interesting thing, or something to point out about the nail going through the palm, is that it would not disrupt the primary circulation of the hand. So there would not be a great deal of bleeding that would occur through the nail wound. But you can see in this illustration, the median nerve is in the pathway of the nail, and so it would transect or macerate the median nerve, which would cause horrific pain up the arm and cause the hand to go partially flaccid. And that's exactly what Dr. Barbet found in his study of driving the nails through the wrist. Josephus was a Jewish historian who defected and became a Roman citizen. He Romanized his name to Flavius Josephus, and he was an eyewitness to the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, where they crucified up to 500 people a day. He wrote that there wasn't enough wood to make crosses for everyone that was to be crucified. Perhaps a bit of hyperbole, but you can understand that it was a bloodbath, the siege of Jerusalem. And he wrote that they were first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died. They were crucified before the wall of the city. The soldiers, out of wrath and hatred they bore for the Jews, nailed those they caught to crosses in different postures by way of jest. An example might be Peter, and not at that same time, but Peter was crucified upside down, traditionally thought, and he preached to his executioners before he died. Archaeology, this is very interesting. There are only 2 remains of crucifixion victims that have been found. And the Romans would have crucified maybe hundreds of thousands of people over 6 centuries of time. But there have only been 2 finds. One was in 1968, which is dated to the early part of the 1st century. That was in Jerusalem. The second find was more recently in 2007 in the northern part of Italy. And you would wonder why we don't find more remains like this, but the reason is that when someone was crucified, their remains were left on the cross to decay and to be eaten by scavenging animals. So you can understand how that furthered the deterrence that they were trying to place on the local population. But really, these are the only 2 finds which seems remarkable to me. But the body could be requested from Roman authority to be buried, as in the case with Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus. From the Jerusalem find, they found this bone, and they didn't know what it was at first. You could see it's some kind of bone with a nail through it, and the tip of the nail is bent. So they cleaned it up, and they were able to get a better look at what it was, and they could see that it was a nail through the calcaneus that was bent, but still in sight. So you could see how that they were not able to extract the nail. The nails would be extracted for reuse, and some within the dark magic crowd would use the nails for different incantations and black magic and that sort of thing. But mostly the nails were reused for crucifixion. And nails was the primary way of fixating the extremities. Sometimes they would be tied if nails were in short supply. So here we have the artist's depiction where you see what they were finally able to recognize after they cleaned the bone. They found that heel in a ossuary, a bone box, in a syrupy liquid. So it was just encrusted with calcium, so they had to clean it up to even see what it was. And they saw that the nail was through the right calcaneus, the heel bone, and that a portion of the left calcaneus, the sustentaculum tali, was stuck to it also. And there were fragments of wood by the head of the nail, also at the bent portion of the nail, so you could see that they put some kind of washer or shim by the head of the nail, in effect, to enlarge the head of the nail so that it would be impossible to pry the foot off the cross. And so you might be asking yourself, well, how did they get the foot off of this victim? Well, there were cut marks on the talus, so it appears that they amputated the foot, took the body down, and then pried the calcaneus with a nail away from the cross. And let's see. There we go. Looks like there's a lag in the slides. I apologize for that. The left calcaneus, the nail had been removed, but you can still see that there is a puncture spot there. So basically how this victim was affixed to the cross was that the right foot was slightly in front of the left foot with nails through both calcaneus bones. The nail from the left calcaneus had been removed for reuse again. The Roman find was similar, that there was a nail through the calcaneus, the right calcaneus. They were not able to date the bones. They were in such poor condition. The body was buried without a coffin or covering, apparently, or how they found it. But the left calcaneus was not present, there was no other bone injury in this particular find in northern Italy. So when the Jerusalem archaeologists thought that the victim may have been hung in position A, but after they cleaned up the bones, they were able to discern that it was the position B that's depicted there, with the legs rotated to the right, again with the right foot slightly in front of the left and nails through both calcaneus. So that was the position of that victim. This brings to mind a verse from Genesis chapter 3, where God speaks to Satan, or in the serpent, and says, I'll put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And that's referred to as the proto-evangelium, or the first gospel. The Romans did break people's legs, and apparently or seemingly they would have observed that this made people die faster. The Jerusalem find victim did have his legs fractured. This is the tibia, where you can see a splintered spiral fracture. The left tibia and fibula have transverse fractures through both. Again, the find in Rome was without evidence of bony injury. This is a still from Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, and what it shows in that scene is the Roman soldier takes a sledgehammer and with a running start goes and hits the legs of the victims to break their legs. And I think that that's precisely accurate, because you can understand it would have taken a high force to create fractures like that in both legs. As a side point, most artwork that you see shows a sapitoneum, where there's a piece of wood attached to the front of the cross where the feet are nailed. That just didn't exist. That's an artistic invention. That never happened. I've looked at a lot of artwork, and the one that I think most approximates or seems to be the most accurate from the historical information is by Nikolai Gay, who's a Russian impressionist from the 1890s, and I think that's the best and most accurate description in artistic work. Psalm 22 is a very prophetic psalm attributed to David, which is 1,000 years before Jesus lived. A pack of villains encircled me, they pierced my hands and my feet, and all my bones are on display as people stare and gloat over me. And you know, crucifixion hadn't even been invented by then. And this is it's an eerie sort of specific description of crucifixion, piercing the hands and feet. And to the point that Justin Martyr used this in his apology to point to the fact that the Messiah would be executed by foreigners. The Jews never used crucifixion as a form of capital punishment. So on to Jesus' cause of death. The cause of death was crucifixion. When we, as physicians, when we speak about the cause of death, what we're really talking about is the mechanism of death, to use precise language. Jesus' cause of death was crucifixion, of course. So we're going to talk about what physicians and people have proposed most popularly. Cardiac rupture, suffocation is probably the most common one you hear. Fatal stab wound, traumatic hemorrhagic shock, and what I proposed was that Jesus may have, and I think did, experience a complication of shock called trauma-induced coagulopathy. The broken heart hypothesis, that Jesus' heart ruptured, kind of has some sentimental value. It was first proposed by St. Bridget of Sweden in the 14th century, but later embraced by a couple of physicians in the mid and late 19th century. And some have proposed, well, maybe Jesus had a cardiac contusion, he fell, he hit something, he had traumatic cardiac rupture. But you can understand that with a traumatic cardiac rupture, that cardiac tamponade and death would occur very rapidly, almost immediately. And that's just not supported by the literary record, the Gospels. The most common cause of cardiac rupture is myocardial infarction, but in a 33-year-old healthy person on a Mediterranean diet seems, pretty unlikely. And even then, if you wanted to embrace that idea, cardiac rupture after myocardial infarction is rare, 1 to 3% of cases, even prior to the modern revascularization technology that we have now. So this has really fallen out of favor, but you can understand that the knowledge of cardiac disease is very different now than it was in the 19th century. Suffocation is the most common thing you hear. It seems like every Easter I hear a sermon about how Jesus suffocated. Suffocation is the interruption of the respiratory apparatus. Asphyxiation is the effect of oxygen deprivation. So suffocation can lead to asphyxiation. Suffocation was first proposed by a French surgeon, Lebec, and a Czechoslovakian surgeon, Hynek, who were aware of Austro-Hungarian army torture in World War I, where people would be suspended with their arms directly over their head and their feet unsupported, and they knew that people appeared to struggle to breathe in that situation. Well, it was also part of the Nazi penal code, and it was used in the concentration camps. And Dr. Barbet, in his book A Doctor at Calvary, had someone describe to him, and he reports in his Appendix 1 of that book. I would encourage you to get that book. It's interesting in many respects, particularly the archaeology chapter. But in the Appendix 1, he recounts an eyewitness report of someone being tortured by suspension torture. They appeared to struggle to breathe and eventually turned blue and died at about 3 hours' time. So suspension torture could be prolonged to murder. And that suggested to Dr. Barbet that Jesus probably suffocated by the inability to exhale and therefore had to pull up to be able to breathe. And he believed that crurifragium, the practice of fracturing the legs, accelerated this process. And you can understand, that the arms are connected to the scapula at the glenohumeral joint, and the scapula is really attached to the chest wall by muscles and soft tissue, and the serratus anterior muscles, if there was a distraction force on the scapula, it would expand the chest wall. So there's some logic here, and that it would flatten the diaphragm relatively and place it at a disadvantage. So someone in this position, you can see that the chest wall is extracted, you can see the serratus anterior, and that breathing would be diaphragmatic. You wouldn't be able to stay in this kind of position for an extended period of time. But what the Nazis did was certainly worse. They would rotate the arms behind the individual and then suspend them with their arms overhead behind, rotated upward, with their feet unsupported, and sometimes they would put weights on the feet, and people could die in this situation, as was reported by Dr. Barbet. Now, Dr. Barbet had also examined the Shroud of Turin, and the Shroud of Turin is beyond the scope of our talk today. There's a couple articles on my website if you'd like to read about that. But he believed it to be the burial cloth of Jesus, and he looked at the blood flow patterns on the shroud and thought, oh, the blood flow is changing position. That must mean that Jesus had to change position on the cross to be able to take a breath. Well, that for the sake of discussion, we'll think of the shroud as authentic. I'm not saying that. We're just in the context of this discussion. If it is the burial cloth of Christ, you have to understand Jewish burial customs in the Second Temple period are well known. The body would be washed, then it would be anointed with perfumes and spices and so forth, wrapped in a shroud, which would then be secured by cloths. Well, Jesus died late in the day, and he was buried with a cursory and incomplete preparation, but his body would have been washed, then wrapped in a shroud, and then the women were going to come back and complete the embalming process on Sunday morning, because they couldn't complete it then. And so if the body here would have been washed before being wrapped in the shroud, because you don't see any blood splotches anywhere else on the cloth. You only see it by the puncture wounds. And rigor mortis had to have been broken to place the arms in front of the body. And so, what the best explanation here is the body was washed, wrapped in the shroud, and blood emanated from the puncture wounds, which can occur in the context of traumatic hemorrhagic shock and violent death, and that the blood flow patterns that you observe are best explained by capillary action of the linen. And so the criticisms of suffocation, well, suspension torture used by the Nazis is simply unlike crucifixion, with the arms directly overhead and the feet unsupported. Crucifixion, the arms were to the side, and the legs were fixed by nails. Suspension torture death could occur very rapidly, within 3 hours, by Dr. Barbet's record. But crucifixion could last for days. There are literary records of crucifixion lasting up to a week. And if Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours, he would have had to pull up over 4,000 times to take a breath. Who can do that, particularly when you're beaten close to death to begin with? And there have been doctors that have done reenactment studies, which is interesting, not a primary point of evidence in my view, but they're interesting to think about. Dr. Zugaby did that, and he monitored vital signs, blood gases, and respiration was unaffected. Blood gases, vital signs were unaffected in their study subjects in their crucifixion reenactment. Now, crurifragium, the practice of breaking the legs, they could hasten the death, and I think one could make the case that this maybe approximates something anatomically that would be similar to the suspension torture, but Jesus' legs were not fractured. He was dead before they got to him. And also, I think it's worthwhile to note that Jesus conversed with the criminals that were next to him, as well as the Apostle John that was standing next to the cross. Now, everybody else was there. They were watching from afar off, the Bible says. So all the disciples, everybody saw what happened, but John was close by and spoke with Jesus at the crucifixion. Dr. Zugaby, this is Dr. Zugaby doing a reenactment experiment. I believe that's his son. So whenever I talk and my son is present, I always say that I'm going to repeat this experiment. But again, he monitored vital signs, blood gases. There was no impairment of respiration or gas exchange. But one interesting point is that in all of these young, healthy participants, none of them were able to pull themselves up with their arms or push themselves up with their legs in this position. Again, looking to Psalm 22, the prophetic psalm from David 1,000 years before Christ, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. Onto the fatal stab wound. Obviously, there's some logical merit here. Nobody could survive that. So could that have been the cause of Jesus' death? Coming to Jesus when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. I've had to pronounce people dead. You will in your career. It's not a pleasant thing, but arguably it doesn't take a physician to know that someone has died. People have thought, that Jesus was alive until the chest wound because they thought that blood can't flow from a dead body. But that premise is flawed because in the context of violent death and traumatic hemorrhagic shock, the blood coagulation can be deranged. Also, a large clot, such as might be in the right chambers of the heart, could be unstable and reliquefy. So that blood emanated from the chest wound cannot be lead to the conclusion that Jesus was alive at that time. The explanation for this appearance of water and blood is easily understandable. If Jesus apparently had a pleural effusion, fluid around the lung, that when a spear entering the chest wall would encounter the fluid, it would be clear. But upon rupturing the heart, blood would mix with the pleural effusion and appear to be blood. This would not have been understood by the observers on the scene, and in fact, Origen, the church father, thought that this was a miraculous sign. But now we can easily understand it, medically speaking. And I would just say that I think that the execution team of the soldiers and centurion have had credible expertise in discerning when someone had died. A pleural effusion, you can see in this CAT scan that a pleural effusion will settle with gravity. And you see the effusion there settled in the posterior right chest cavity. But someone suspended on the cross, the fluid would settle in the anterior portion and inferior portion of the chest wall, so that a spear entering the chest wall would first encounter the pleural effusion, then rupture the right side of the heart, or presumably the right side, which would have a larger volume of blood at the moment of death. And as a point of interest, the Shroud of Turin puncture wound is at the right fifth intercostal space. But if this was then this would cause that appearance of water and blood, and so we can understand that it wasn't a miracle, that it's explainable. One of the famous articles on the crucifixion is Edwards' article in the Journal of American Medical Association, 1985. And Dr. Edwards said, "The important feature may not be how he died, but rather whether he died. Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge." I agree with that. Traumatic hemorrhagic shock. This, I believe, is to be the most logical explanation or mechanism of Jesus' death. Shock has a lot of meanings in the English language, to the feeling of electricity, to being emotionally surprised or flabbergasted. But what we're really talking about in medical language is that the imbalance of oxygen supply and demand due to intravascular volume depletion and critically impaired cardiac preload. The subtypes of shock would be hypovolemic shock, and specifically in the context of Jesus, traumatic hemorrhagic shock or traumatic hypovolemic shock. Dr. Zugaby, I think he was a forensics pathologist, and he named Jesus' cause of death this way: cardiac and respiratory arrest due to hypovolemic and traumatic shock due to crucifixion. And I think that is the accurate cause of death. Now, there are clues that Jesus was progressing into shock. He was sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, he wouldn't have lost a lot of blood that way, but it speaks to the intense anxiety he was experiencing at that time, as he would have been sweaty and clammy. He would have lost blood through the crown of thorns and the multiple beatings that he had, which were above and beyond what the usual crucifixion victim would receive. It appears that he had a pleural effusion, which would indicate that there were third spacing of fluid there, and he would have been deprived fluid from the point of arrest onwards. So by the time that Jesus had to walk to the execution site, either 300 or 1,000 meters, depending on the site, he wasn't able to do it. He was stumbling. They had to recruit a bystander, Simon the Cyrene, to carry the patibulum for him. Jesus cried out in thirst on the cross. Now, thirst that occurs in the context of shock is not like normal thirst. The arterial system has baroreceptors that sense volume depletion, and they start stimulating the thirst centers in the brain centrally. And also the renin-angiotensin system from the kidneys starts centrally stimulating the thirst centers also. to say to the victim, you really have to get water on board right now. And so there would be two physiologic mechanisms centrally stimulating the thirst centers of the brain. So the kind of thirst that someone experiences in the context of shock is a maddening type of thirst where people may have hallucinations of water and that sort of thing. So when Jesus cried out in thirst, he was probably screaming. Trauma-induced coagulopathy is a potential complication from shock, and it's really entered the medical literature probably in the early 2000s. It's said to occur in up to 25% of traumatic hemorrhagic shock presentations in trauma hospitals, and it's a bad player with a 4 to 6-fold likelihood of fatality. It occurs in the context of shock, and specifically the three telltale things that occur with this are tissue injury and hemorrhage, which you can understand. Jesus was bludgeoned all over his body with lacerations and so forth, so extensive tissue injury and hemorrhage. Hypothermia, particularly if a core body temperature reaches 35 or less. Acidemia, which would be common in the context of shock, as well as systemic inflammation. Hypothermia, specifically at 35 degrees Celsius or less, decreases clotting time, or increases clotting time, decreases enzymatic activity rate. It decreases plug formation by the von Willebrand factor with platelets. It activates clot lysis and fibrinolysis. And we know that it was cold that day. The average temperature in Jerusalem is 8 to 20 degrees Celsius, or 46 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit, but can be as low as -1 degree Celsius. And we know, the Bible specifically says it was cold in John 18:18. But the reason we know that is that Peter he followed Jesus after his rest to the high priest mansion, and he goes and stands by the fire by the temple guard to warm himself. Now, and you can understand that's pretty risky. In fact, that's where he's challenged. He said, and they challenged him and said, well, you're a Galilean. We know that you were with him. And he starts denying Christ at that time. And then he even gets challenged, and somebody says, no, you cut off my relative's ear. And that was Malchus, And you know that Peter wasn't aiming for the ear. And so Peter went to stand by the fire and place himself at risk of arrest for attempting to kill this relative of the high priest's staff. So it had to have been pretty cold, I think, for Peter to take that level of risk, to go stand by the fire to warm himself. How cold was it? Well, the Gospels don't give us the temperature. The thermometer wasn't invented till the 16th century by Galileo, so we just have to go by Peter's behavior. Acidosis occurs with tissue ischemia. Lactic acidosis and inflammatory mediators cause systemic toxicity. Vasoconstriction, you can understand volume depletion, cold, sweaty. He would be vasoconstricting on the cross, would worsen tissue hypoperfusion. If there was lung injury, pulmonary contusion, pneumothorax, any of that, if there was impaired gas exchange, then there would be a respiratory component that would worsen the metabolic acidosis. And in prolonged hypovolemia, the endothelial cells can be energy depleted and non-responsive to vasoconstrictors, which would be a terminal occurrence. Trauma-induced coagulopathy occurs in the context of three telltale things: what's tissue injury and bleeding, acidosis, and hypothermia. And all those factors were present in Jesus' execution. And what it does is it creates a positive feedback loop, or a snowball effect, that just keeps getting worse and worse. And so it'd be a progressive thing. It would be difficult to control even in modern trauma centers with repletion of blood products and so forth. But of course there was no treatment there, so it would just be left to run its course. And after I finished the manuscript of the first article, I read this verse and I thought, oh, Jesus told us his cause of death. He said, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for their forgiveness of sins." He said his blood would be poured out, he said he would bleed to death. And that he said that the new covenant would be inaugurated by his crucifixion. The new covenant he's pointing to is Jeremiah chapter 31, where God said, I'm going to make a new covenant with man, not like the old covenant they got from Moses, but it would be a new covenant where the heart of mankind would be transformed, and that they would have God's law within their heart. Their hearts would be changed. And so that God was redefining his relationship with mankind through the crucifixion of Jesus. And that Jesus said that he would die by bleeding to death. On a theological point, I'm not an academic theologian, but I think we should recognize that there is suffering that Jesus experienced that's beyond the horrendous physical suffering that we have been talking about. On the cross, Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" So there's a separation that he experienced from God. This is also in Psalm 22, the prophetic psalm of the crucifixion. Many people, this may be a little controversial, but many people believe that Jesus was in hell from the time of his death until the resurrection. That's part of the Apostles' Creed, which is thought to be consistent with the Apostles' belief. It dates back to at least the 4th century, that he descended into hell, and the third day he rose again from the dead. Even Peter, on his first sermon in the church on the day of Pentecost, quoted this verse, "For thou shalt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption, or for his body to see decay." And so the point I want to make here is that there was a spiritual suffering that Jesus was experiencing as in the context as part of our redemption that goes beyond the physical suffering, and probably is in a way that we can't fully understand humanly, except to recognize that there was a suffering, a spiritual suffering, that maybe eclipses the physical suffering. The resurrection of Jesus, what's called the Resurrection Creed is the first creed in the church. And Dr. Habermas thinks it dates to about the 3rd year after the crucifixion. Even critical scholar Bart Ehrman believes it dates to within 5 years of the crucifixion. Paul didn't write it, but he wrote it down for us, so we have it. And the creed is this: Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep or died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also. And this is very telling, because, most of those people that are described in this creed died violent deaths. All the disciples except John died violent deaths. A lot of the early believers, were tortured and killed. St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was traditionally thought to be one of the children that Jesus blessed, was fed to lions in the Colosseum. So these people would die before they would say it didn't happen. And that's a compelling point. I'll quote Dr. Zugby again. He said, "Finally, we must ask, why would the disciples worship Jesus if he pulled a fast one? The major question here appears to be, if Jesus did not die on the cross and appeared before his disciples severely wounded and in need of medical care, would they have put their own lives in danger by proclaiming him the Messiah? Would they have relinquished all their possessions and undergone extreme hardships and dangers to preach to the world Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection? I don't think so. And I think that's very well stated." So the crucifixion of Jesus is a historical fact. It's well known that Jesus, historical scholars, Christian or not, understand and recognize that Jesus was a historical figure who had a profound effect on his disciples, who was executed by Pontius Pilate, and that the disciples experienced something that made them believe that he had resurrected from the dead. So if you're going to deal with that fact, how do you think about it? The decision tree is limited. Either Jesus resurrected and Christianity is true, and which is what I believe and Christians believe, but there's a lot of people that, just will not believe that. I understand that. Some people, how would you explain this information then? Well, some would say Jesus didn't die, and what's called, there are various fictional iterations of that, but I'll call them the swoon theory, but somehow that Jesus survived crucifixion and went on the various, life story after that. But we've just talked about crucifixion. You can understand that nobody survived crucifixion once they were delivered to the execution team. People sometimes ask me, did anyone ever survive crucifixion? And there is one literary reference of someone surviving crucifixion. Josephus saw 3 of his friends being crucified during the siege of Jerusalem, and he went and was able to obtain a stay of execution, and they were taken down off the cross. 2 of them died anyway, because the body cannot just tolerate that level of insult. But one of them was nursed back to health, and that's the only person that there's ever a historical reference to surviving crucifixion. If you were going to be crucified, you were going to die, and you can understand Roman military discipline was austere. If you fell asleep when you were on watch, you were going to be beaten to death. If you let a capital criminal or any criminal escape, you were going to be killed also. And we see a reference to that in Acts chapter 16 of the Philippian jailer who thought Paul and Silas had escaped jail. He was going to fall on his sword rather than accept that what was going to come to him. So that's why they delivered a death blow to Jesus before they released the body. They were not going to allow even the thought that he could survive that, because it would mean their death. So the idea that Jesus survived crucifixion alive is just not logically supportable. So, well, what about the disciples? Must have been the disciples. They goofed up somehow, and maybe they perpetrated a hoax. They were just trying to deceive people. Well, that would have disappeared fairly quickly as soon as the disciples started getting killed, because people will die sometimes for something they truly and deeply believe in, but nobody dies for a lie. So perpetrating a hoax when there was no motivation, no reward to do that, doesn't make any sense at all, and it would place them at risk of execution. So that just doesn't make sense at all. Well, maybe the body was snatched, and maybe they went to the wrong tomb, and then they started telling people that Jesus resurrected. Well, how much sense does that make? I mean, Mary Magdalene went to Peter and said, they've taken away his body and I don't know where they've laid it. If somebody finds an empty tomb, it in no way suggests that somebody resurrected. So the logical problems with all of the naturalistic explanations is apparent. So some people have gravitated towards psychiatric sorts of explanations. It's, well, maybe the disciples were hallucinating. Well, that begs the question then, what causes hallucinations? What are hallucinations? A hallucination is an experience in one or more of the 5 senses in the absence of external stimuli that is perceived by the conscious mind as real. Well, there's a cause for that has to be identified. Potential causes might fit in 3 categories: what we'd call psychophysiologic causes, where there's alteration of the brain structure and function, maybe a tumor, seizure, something like that. Psychobiochemical causes, maybe hallucinogenic drugs, as the name would imply, or chemical delirium, delirium tremens, like in alcohol withdrawal, or severe mental illness, or what you'd call psychodynamic causes, where hallucinations intrude into the conscious mind. Most of these, they're critical theologic scholars that propose this stuff, and usually it's around grief and bereavement. Now, people that are in complex grief and bereavement do have hallucinatory phenomena. They're not really considered pathological, but just in the context of bereavement, usually it's the sense of closeness to the departed person, and it's almost always the spouse. But in rare cases, they can have auditory hallucinations. When my grandfather passed away, my grandmother told me once in a while she would hear him call her name. Well, that's not pathologic, that's part of a grieving process. In rare cases, people can have visual experiences. When people have visual experiences, they're not interactive, and the telltale thing about these kinds of experiences in bereavement are that they never convince the person that their spouse resurrected. They never produce a life change. In fact, they're very private experiences that most people won't even talk about unless you ask them about it. What about mass hysteria, or more commonly described group sociogenic illness in modern parlance? People can have, groups of people can have hallucinatory experiences, even visual hallucinatory experiences, but the group dynamic is very specific. They have a collective sense of excitement and expectation. That's very much unlike the disciples who were in hiding after Jesus was, crucified. Jesus, met them after his crucifixion. The door was locked. They were in hiding. Nobody went to the tomb on Sunday morning to give Jesus a cup of coffee and a donut, have an Easter Sunday service. Nobody was there. The ladies went to finish the embalming. So nobody believed that this was going to happen. In Jewish culture, they might have had a concept of resurrection in the end of time, but nobody had the idea. Even though he told them, nobody believed a near-term resurrection 3 days later. Nobody believed that. So the group dynamic is very different. And individuals that have hallucinogenic experiences in hysteria or sociogenic context, they're not identical. So they may have some sort of experience, but none of them are identical. And that makes sense, of course, because any kind of hallucinatory symptom occurs specifically in the milieu of the individual's brain. They're not a group experience, cannot be. What about conversion disorder? Conversion disorder is a suspension of neurologic function as a result of psychologic trauma. A common example might be a mother finds her child drowned in the swimming pool and goes blind. What happens in that context of a conversion, that eventually people get over that and they resume their lives. But the psychologist Carl Jung thought that, well, maybe Paul had a conversion disorder because, he went blind after he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. The problem with that is in more modern understanding of conversion disorders is that a hallucination would not be part of that experience. And so it would require additional diagnostic clarification, a dual diagnosis, if you will, to even apply that to Paul in the first place. And secondly, it does not create a life change in the people that experience conversion disorder, whereas Paul, who was an inhumane persecutor and would be happy to see Christians killed. He voted to have Stephen killed, for example, held the jackets while they were stoning him. So he was very inhumane with respect to Christians in his prior life. But when he became converted, it created a lifelong radical change that he produced a great deal of theological literature and spread the gospel to the non-Jewish world of his time in spite of relentless and repetitive persecution and assassination attempts. So that's a very radical change for his life, which is inconsistent with conversion disorder. Proponents of hallucination hypothesis are theological scholars. And when I was reading through all of that stuff, it was clear to me that they had never seen someone in a state of delirium. They had never seen, because they couldn't have seen. It was clear that they just didn't understand what they were talking about at all. And the bigger point, of course, is that any kind of psychiatric explanation has nothing to say to the group encounters that are recorded in the Bible of the disciples with the resurrection Jesus. Hallucination as a standalone explanation is not acceptable. The diagnosis of the underlying pathology must be addressed. It has to be. As a physician, you know that. And otherwise, how can you treat the person unless you can figure out why they're having that, right? So in these theological guys, this is just, it's either vague or just completely lacking. Again, it was clear that they just didn't know what they were talking about. And none of that is in peer-reviewed literature. Could the disciples have all suffered severe psychiatric illness and at the same time organize and launch the rapid expansion of Christianity in the first century? That just doesn't make sense. It's not possible. Christianity spread so far and so fast that by AD 67, Nero launched the first mass crucifixion, or a mass campaign of persecution of Christians in AD 67. So they became a recognized people group in just a generation. So that's a rapid expansion. And again, hallucinations offer no explanation for group encounters. So in conclusion, I would like to say the descriptions of Jesus' death by eyewitness observers are consistent with modern medical understanding. This is intrinsic evidence of the authenticity of the Gospels. And this is an important point because this bothered C.S. Lewis. He understood that the Gospels did not appear to be mythological literature. Mythological literature would be very different. We can look at the Gospels and understand that they're explainable in modern medical knowledge. Lewis, of course, was an avowed atheist who went on to become a Christian and a major Christian apologist and proponent of Christian faith in his later life. The best explanation of Jesus' death is traumatic hemorrhagic shock with a possible complication of trauma-induced coagulopathy. To suggest that Jesus did not die on the cross is untenable. Early Christians were convinced that Jesus was confirmed to be the Jewish Messiah by his bodily resurrection from the dead. They were relentless in preaching Jesus' death and resurrection in the face of persecution and threat of death. Only a valid experience can account for that. Psychiatric explanations fail to offer a plausible explanation for the disciples' belief in Jesus' bodily resurrection. In particular, they offer no explanation for the group encounters. And in short, the biblical accounts of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ remain the best explanation, and the Gospels can be considered reliable eyewitness accounts. To talk about the greater meaning for a minute, God sent his son, Jesus, referring to himself to the world, not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. That's a telling point. God's not mad at you. He's trying to save the world. And he did that through Jesus. For he, Jesus, rescued us from the kingdom of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his dear Son, who purchased our freedom and forgave our sins. If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. For God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And so Jesus redefined God's relationship with humanity. He forgave us. He forgave the entire world. It lays with us as humans to respond to that and to receive that. And to those that embrace faith in Christ, they are translated, one translation says, into the kingdom of God. And there's a spiritual transformation that the person becomes a new creature. They experience a conversion. They're born from above. They're born again. Different descriptions in the Bible, but there is a spiritual transformation that takes place when people come to faith in Christ. Repentance and forgiveness has really two components. One is contrition, where we have an awareness of sin in our life and its weight on our conscience. And the second being faith arising from the Gospels that our sins are forgiven and removed through the sacrificial death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So then that leads us to, I'd like to close in a final prayer. And I know you're a great group of young people and committed Christians. Maybe there's some people that are not Christians, or maybe maybe you've come to a point where you want to pray, you want to receive Christ, and you want to follow Christ and receive forgiveness of his sins and assurance of your salvation in eternity. Then I want to close in prayer, and what I'd like for you to do, if you would like, please repeat after me, and we'll close with this prayer. Please say with me, Dear Lord Jesus, I know that I am a sinner, and I ask for your forgiveness. I believe you died for my sins and rose from the dead. I turn from my sins and invite you to come into my heart and life. I want to trust and follow you as my Lord and Savior. Amen. So with that, I'll close, and I'll yield back to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bergeron, for that very insightful and enlightening lecture. Now we can move on to the next part of our program, which is the Q&A. We are very grateful to Dr. Bergeron for being willing to spend some more time with us to entertain some questions. So if you have any questions regarding the topic, please don't hesitate to input them in the Q&A section. But for now, I have a few questions here with me. First, how many % do you feel the Shroud of Turin could be genuine? Maybe you could also explain for our other guests here what the Shroud of Turin is and its significance.
That's a really lengthy, there's volumes of books written about the Shroud of Turin, volumes. It's maybe sometime I can do a lecture on that if it's a point of interest to you. I've written a couple of articles that are on my website, and I would encourage you to look at those, because that's a synopsis really of the scientific, as a description of the cloth and description of the image and the science around it. To give a short answer, I would say that the Shroud of Turin has been extensively studied, and to date it has not been explained away. That's pretty telling. Most of what you hear about the Shroud of Turin is inaccurate. It's spin and people wanting to make a sensational explanation, but it has not been explained away. So it's an artifact extraordinaire, and I would just encourage you to read the articles on my website. I think that'll be a first starting point to give you some answers. Dr. Zugaby, in his book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, a Forensic Inquiry, dedicates a lot of content to the Shroud of Turin. That would be a good starting point. And you can look at my articles, and it's well referenced, so there you can see where to look further to study that in detail. Specifically, the writings of Ray Rogers are elegant descriptions of the scientific inquiry of the cloth itself. If you say your question is interesting, it's not. It's to say a percentage of what I think about it is kind of an unscientific idea. My mind functions in kind of black and white, you know. In science, we want to talk about the greater preponderance of truth and examine the facts and so forth. And so I don't think in terms of percentages. I would simply say that I'm not going to tell you it's authentic. I don't think that's a scientific determination. Even the Catholic Church, I think, states that it's a matter of personal faith, and I think that's reasonable. But what I would say, I've studied it in the context of everything I've studied that, and I would just say that it cannot be explained away as a hoax or fraud. It has not been, but I'm not going to tell you it's authentic. That's for you to determine and for you to study.
Next question. Lazarus was bound and had to be unbound, but the Shroud of Turin is only like a blanket. Why?
Seems like you all have a lot of interest in the Shroud of Turin. I specifically avoided talking about the Shroud of Turin in my book because the other physicians that have written about it, Dr. Barbet and Dr. Zuckerby, give a lot of content to it. I did not, because I know that the shroud itself has its own controversy, and I didn't want to use it as a primary source of evidence because I thought that might open me to exposure to circular reasoning. So I didn't want to use it as a primary point of evidence. So I only talked about the Shroud of Turin in my book in the context of Dr. Barbet's suffocation hypothesis, where he had the a priori conclusion that the blood flow patterns on the shroud image suggest Jesus was changing place on the cross to be able to breathe, which I thought was an erroneous conclusion, which it was what I said earlier. But to answer your question, why the Shroud of Turin is not a blanket. It was Jewish funerary custom to wrap a body in a shroud, and so that would be a cloth that would cover from head to toe, and that it was affixed by strips of cloth to secure the shroud around it. It's my understanding that even today it is Jewish custom to wrap a body in the shroud.
Thank you. Next question. Why is it that the cross is always depicted as a cross with the extension above the horizontal beam and not as the T-shaped cross? How did the confusion come in?
I don't know how the confusion came in, but because the other type of cross had been used, but you can understand that the carpentry demands of the making the crosses, when they made so many of them, that the crux that the tau cross is called, would be the one that would be used. How the error came in, I don't know exactly, except that I would say that anybody that made a crucifix, any artistic depiction of the cross, those things didn't really start occurring till, I want to say, the 6th century. I could be wrong, but they come much later. The artistic depictions of the cross are after crucifixion was no longer in use. So the paintings and things that you see may be subject to error, and I guess that's about the best I could say, that artistic depiction and iconography post-dates the crucifixion time period.
All right. What is the relevance of the crown of thorns? Did it contribute in any way to the death of Jesus?
I would have created presumably puncture wounds in the scalp, and there would have been some bleeding associated with that. So it would have contributed some blood loss, probably not a huge amount. But I think it's a point of interest historically that they were mocking him that way. It speaks to the ire of the Roman soldiers, so that's why I included it in the talk. So I think it maybe contributed a small amount to bleeding and trauma, but not directly as a mechanism of death.
Okay. Next question. What was your greatest and most significant discovery upon studying the medical aspect leading to Jesus' death?
I think when I started studying this because the medical student group at the nearby university asked me to talk, and I just started reviewing the literature of what physicians had written, and it bothered me that there was not a clear consensus among physicians. I thought that shouldn't be so. I've done a lot of medical legal work in my career, and I don't have that luxury to say, I don't really know, maybe it's one of 3 or 4 things. I don't have that luxury. I have to, and it just occurred to me that if we studied it in detail, we should be able to conclude with a reasonable degree of certainty what the cause of death was. And as I started studying that and reviewed the literature and came to the trauma-induced coagulopathy, it was like an epiphany to me. I thought, oh my gosh, all those factors were present. And then when I read the verse in Matthew where Jesus, I think, said that his cause of death would be blood loss. It just seemed to all fit together. I didn't expect to come across what I think is really the cause of Jesus' death, the shock complications and trauma-induced coagulopathy. And then I guess to me personally, I think the result of now over 10 years of studying this is that I'm more convinced than ever that what we believe as Christians is true.
Thank you, Dr. Bergeron. Next question. Were the experiments that were presented as basis, like the father-son experiment, for the vital signs of those who were crucified, depicting a close representation as to what happened before the victims of crucifixion?
I'm not sure if I understand the question fully. Dr. Zuckerby did monitor vital signs, even blood gases, and they were undisturbed. And I'm not sure if I understood the second part of the question. Could you repeat that?
I'll just repeat the entire question. Were the experiments that were presented as basis, like the father-son experiment, for the vital signs of those who were crucified, excuse me, depict a close representation as to what happened before to the victims of crucifixion?
Well, that's a valid point, and some people would point to that and say, well, that's not, how can you conclude anything from that? I don't mean to use that as a primary point of argument, except to say that it's interesting, because if you're going to say that people were suffocating on the cross, I think there's a lot of logical problems with that, just from the gospel depictions, and then it just didn't seem to fit with any of the reenactments. So yes, you're true, those were young, healthy people who hadn't been beaten close to death, but they didn't have any trouble breathing when they were suspended on the cross, and their vital signs didn't change, and their blood gases didn't change. And it's, I think, just a kind of a side point to say, to be supportive of the idea that suffocation is it just really doesn't make a lot of medical sense as Jesus' cause of death. Again, I believe it was due to, how that became popularized was Dr. Barbet's book, A Doctor at Calvary, became very popular, and it became preached about all over the place. Every Easter you hear a sermon about how Jesus suffocated, and that's where it came from, Dr. Barbet's book, because that's where it became popular. And Dr. Barbet, in respect of his academic integrity, he did say that there were other opinions, but that was his. And I guess it's easy for lay people to say, oh, suffocation, yeah, I understand that. When we talk about shock and progression of shock and biochemical complications that can occur, that becomes a little harder discussion. But in biological systems and in medicine, things don't always come to us in simple terms.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bergeron. Next question. In John chapter 20, verses 24 to 27, the one with Thomas doubting that Jesus resurrected, it is mentioned that the nails were in the hands of Jesus, and this might be the reason why the nail in the palm is widespread with regards to artworks done about Jesus' crucifixion. Is this a contradiction, since we know that the nails in the crucifixion are pierced at the wrist?
Well, to create a stable fixation, again, it could go through the base of the palm, and I guess you would call that the hand, at least I would. The nail could be proximal to the wrist, I think would also create a stable fixation. I don't think it's contradictory. I think the artwork is contradictory. I think to put a nail through the center of the hand that you see in most artwork, I don't think that would work. I think it would pull out. It would hurt a lot, but it would pull out. But I think that to create a stable fixation, as with Dr. Barbet's experiments, it would go through the wrist bones. And I would think that as being, I would describe that as the hand. And I'm not a student of ancient languages. I don't know that in Aramaic or Hebrew whether they would make a distinction between hand, wrist, or what. So I don't think it's a contradiction.
Were Jesus' punishments more severe compared to others, Could he have died while he was scourged on the way to the Calvary if he wasn't God?
Uh, First, yes, I think that his punishment was much more severe than what was usual, because again, you have he's beaten at the home of the high priest. It's not really described how he was beaten, but it probably was pretty severe, because they hated him. They thought he was guilty of death. In fact, they it was a murder conspiracy. They railroaded and entrapped Pilate into crucifying him. So they would have beaten him, and their corporal punishment was unrestricted. Then he's beaten by the Roman soldiers. Then he's scourged. The Roman philosopher Seneca said that there's many reasons a person could die before mounting the cross. So I think, yeah, his beating was more severe. Anyone's beating would have been severe, but his was doubly severe, and that's has explanatory power to say that why Jesus died so quickly, because the other people hadn't died by the time he died. There was something happening in his body physiologically that wasn't happening to the other people, and that's why I think the component of shock and the progression of shock and complications is the best explanation for that. So yeah, he was beaten more. The second part of that question was, did he have special dispensation because he was God? It's a theological point, but I'll speak to it as I would understand it. In Philippians chapter 2, Jesus laid aside his position as God. He lived as a human being. He called himself the Son of Man. He was, in effect, saying, I'm a human being. And it wouldn't have been understood any other way. So Jesus lived as a man. He died as a man. And I don't think he had any special dispensation to live any longer on the cross. In fact, he probably would have rather died more quickly. He was praying in the garden, if you can get me out of this, God, please do it now. So it was not an experience he would have relished. In fact, it was horrible for him, physically, and I think in a spiritual way that we talked about.
Okay. Next question. It's a popular teaching, especially during the Holy Week, that Jesus breathed his last, or at least said it is finished, at exactly 3 p.m. How accurate do you think this is? If it is accurate, what do you think is its significance?
Well, the Synoptic Gospels say the time of death is 3 p.m., so I take that again. I talked about discrepancies, and look at J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, about that. I think it well explained. It's really a theological question. When Jesus died, the veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom, and I think that signifies that the way to God had been redefined and was open to human beings, and so that it is finished. What does it mean? I think it means, if you ask me, and I'm not an academic theologian, I think it means that the Old Testament was finished and the way to God was inaugurated by a new covenant in Jesus, so that humans can now have access to God through faith. That's what I think it means when he said it is finished and the pathway to God was torn open.
What are the bases of those who believe in the swoon theory? Are there archaeological or circumstantial evidences that support the swoon theory?
No, there are fictional accounts, that Jesus was nursed back to health and moved to the south of France with Mary Magdalene, or he went to India and started an ashram, and those are all fictional sort of things. They're really not supportable, and again, just the notion that someone could be delivered to crucifixion and mounted on a cross, that they would survive that, that's just untenable. It's just illogical at the face of it. And I think, it's people struggling to find an explanation to explain away the death and resurrection of Christ. And I think the logic of it falls flat. And in medicine we form differential diagnoses. We want to make a list of potential explanations and for symptoms, and we want to arrive at a diagnosis, and we stratify that based on logical merit, and then we collect special tests, and we continue to refine our differential diagnosis until we come to what we think is the best working diagnosis for what is occurring with a patient, right? It's a logical process. When you look at the naturalistic explanations that seek to explain away the death and resurrection of Christ, none of them are logical. You just have to dispense with them. And now I understand that to consider the death and resurrection of Jesus as valid, you have to believe at least God exists, and if you believe God exists, then that a miracle can occur. But some people just won't think that. They won't believe that. They don't want to believe it. But God is anything supernatural. God is not studied scientifically. It's not meant to be. It's beyond the scope of science. So when people want to adopt a belief system where God does not exist, and it's not, that miracles don't occur, and that Jesus Christ could not possibly be who he said he was, then they're accepting a belief system that is not substantiated. It's a belief system, in effect atheism, and is a religion of its own. It's a philosophical point, but you can understand. But going to great lengths to try to explain away the death and resurrection of Jesus leaves you flat logically with the explanations that most people embrace.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bergeron. Next question. What is the physiologic explanation of hematidrosis? What is the management for treating hematidrosis?
Well, as I said, the only two cases that have been very well studied and biopsied, which I showed earlier, and they were different. So the precise mechanism of why that occurs I would call it a medical mystery. We don't really know. It's too rare to have been well studied. In recurrent hematidrosis, it's always reported in the context of anxiety. So the treatment is a treatment for anxiety.
Okay. How did Jesus resurrect after dying on the cross? What is the medical explanation for this?
Oh, there isn't one. It was a miracle. So it's not something that there's a medical explanation for. What medicine can talk to in terms of the resurrection is when people want to propose medical explanations for what the disciples believe, such as psychiatric phenomena, hallucinations, then we can talk to that and we can examine the logic of those kind of propositions, and just as I've done and done in more detail in the article of Dr. Habermas and in the book, I mean, those things just fall flat, and they smack of just a lack of understanding. People that propose those things just don't understand. So, there's medicine cannot speak to the resurrection or anything about life after death, for that matter. But specifically about Jesus' resurrection, we can't explain anything about that from a medical standpoint. But when people offer medical explanations for what the disciples believed about Jesus' resurrection, we can step up and say, wait a minute, that's just not logical at all.
Okay. Next question. In John chapter 20, verse 14, Mary does not recognize the resurrected Jesus. Why do you think this is? Did Jesus' physical appearance change due to the crucifixion ordeal? Or did this just mean that Mary was not expecting him?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly. Maybe it's because she wasn't expecting it. It's hard to say. On their road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him either until they stopped and had dinner with him. So I don't know what it was. I can't answer that.
Okay. What and where what and where is the major site of blood loss if it is hemorrhagic shock?
I don't think there was a major site. He was beaten all over his body. Uh, and he would have been scourged all over his body, front and back. And the flagrum would have leather straps with lead pieces that would be like a dumbbell sewn into the end that would cause lacerations. And I hate to invoke the Shroud of Turin, but there's over 100 lash marks on the Shroud of Turin. Uh, so, he would have been beaten all over his body. That would have been typical. So the tissue injury and bleeding was diffuse. It was all over, lacerations all over his body.
Okay. Next question. Could Jesus have also suffered from Takotsubo syndrome?
Oh, did you read my book? Who asked that question? Takotsubo, you know what that is, right? That's the jar that the Japanese used to catch octopus with, right? And Takotsubo syndrome is called the broken heart hypothesis, or the broken heart syndrome, right? And it creates symptoms that are like a heart attack, but then they subside in the absence of any cardiac pathology. Jesus is not, he doesn't fit the category that's usually in women older than age 50. I think, if I remember this right, and forgive me if I misquote, but I speak to it in my book. And it subsides in the absence of cardiac disease. So it's a good question. There is a syndrome called the broken heart syndrome, but it's not relevant in this context, I don't think. And I would refer you to my book for a specific discussion on that.
Okay. Next question. Can you recommend any animated or visual reconstruction or documentaries or movies that show about the medical perspectives on Jesus' death, especially ones that are layman friendly and good for sharing to everyone?
Oh, no. I don't know. I mean, I think Mel Gibson's movie was very good. There are points in there that I don't think are accurate. But I know it's well researched, and I know he really attempted to do a good job. The bigger point is that I don't think any artistic depiction or movie depiction can accurately depict it. I mean, I think he was bludgeoned. I mean, he was beaten. He was beaten. He could have died before he got to the cross. He was stumbling on his way there. He couldn't. He was progressing into shock. I mean, he was just beaten to a point that maybe was unrecognizable. And Isaiah said we hid our faces from him. He was probably horrible to look upon at that point.
May we just ask what part of Mel Gibson's movie was not accurate?
Oh, it's been a lot of years since I watched that. So I don't know. I think the shape of the cross is just the one that comes to my mind. But I think there was a lot of accuracy. I think it was well done. Not to throw a stone at Mel Gibson. I think he did a good job. But I think there was traditional points that I would think maybe are not exactly the way it was. But they're minor. I think that's probably a good movie. And again, I showed the still. I think the breaking the legs scene was precisely accurate.
And I think we're down to our last question. How does studying what Jesus went through help you to understand the gospel better? In other words, what's the main theological implication of the medical evidence of Christ's crucifixion?
Well, as I said, to me personally, I mean, after studying this for so long, it made me conclude or reinforce the conclusion that what we believe as Christians is accurate. But as I said, in the book, I constructed in the way that I would construct a report to submit in a courtroom, and there are a lot of things in there that I can't really cover in the lecture today, but the apologetics part of that is that the things that happened to Jesus, we can read about them, we can understand it's not mythological literature, it's historically accurate, and it provides an intrinsic sort of evidence that the Gospels are in fact what they say they are, and that historically the books were written by the people that we think they wrote, that were historically handed down, that they're considered to be accurate and uncorrupted as they pass through time, and that that alternate explanations simply fail a logical test from the standpoint of logic and from the standpoint of medically. So I think the apologetics sort of thing, that we want to be able to give an answer for the faith that we have, I think it's useful to have a working knowledge of what happened to Jesus and why the alternate explanations just really don't make sense. So I think it has importance to study the crucifixion of Jesus that way, from the context of apologetics, to reinforce what we believe is historically and logically accurate, and on a spiritual level, that it helps reinforce the faith that I have, and hopefully everyone listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Bergeron, for answering all of our questions. And thank you also for sharing your knowledge and invaluable insights to all of us tonight.
It's been a pleasure to be with you all, and it's a wonderful organization you have. So I encourage you and encourage you as you go through your life and practice, and to share the gospel. A voice of faith and ethics in medicine is much needed. So I strongly encourage you. God bless you all.
Thank you again, Dr. Bergeron. And to continue with our